The Duke didn't know he had a son until a hungry child who was his own son appeared at his gate begging for bread. Before starting the story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe to the channel to motivate us. And watch this story till the very end. I ensure that you won't regret it. The boy's fingers had stopped feeling the cold 3 hours ago. That was when the rain had soaked through the last dry patch of his shirt, the small square beneath his left arm, where he'd been holding his mother's shawl before the wind tore it away. Now there was nothing between his skin and the November wind except torn linen that clung to his ribs like a second layer of ice. He didn't remember deciding to walk toward the iron gates. His legs had simply kept moving, one foot dragging after the other, because stopping meant lying down in the mud, and lying down meant never getting up again. The way Mama hadn't gotten up this morning. The estate gates rose before him like the entrance to a cathedral, black iron scrollwork, taller than 3 men, crowned with stone eagles whose beaks pointed down as if to peck at anything unworthy that dared approach. Beyond them, through the sheeting rain, he could make out lights. Golden, warm, impossibly far away. His stomach cramped so violently he doubled over, one small hand gripping the gate's iron bar to keep from falling. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's crust of bread. Or was it the day before? Time had become strange since Mama's breathing had stopped. Hours folded into each other. Darkness and daylight meant nothing when you were alone. He pressed his forehead against the cold metal and closed his eyes. The rain drummed against his back. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. His teeth chattered so hard he bit his tongue, tasted copper. Please, he whispered to no one, to God maybe, to the golden lights behind the gates. Please. His mother's last words had been very clear, though her voice had been barely a rasp. If something happens to me, go to Ashford Park. Find the Duke. Tell him who you are. He didn't understand what she'd meant. Tell him who you are. He was nobody. A 7-year-old boy with no father, no home, no name that mattered to anyone except the woman who died holding his hand in a freezing attic room 3 streets from the workhouse. But Mama had never lied to him, not once, not even when the truth was terrible. So he'd walked, 2 days, maybe 3, through villages where people pulled their children inside when they saw him coming, past coaching inns where the stable boys threw stones to chase him from the warm smell of horses and hay, along roads that turned his bare feet black with mud and blood. And now he was here, at gates he couldn't open, before a house that might as well be on the moon. His knees buckled. He caught himself against the gate, but his hands were so numb they slipped on the wet iron. He went down hard, palms scraping stone, cold water immediately soaking through his breeches. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. For a long moment, he simply knelt there in the gravel and the rain, staring at his own hands pressed flat against the ground. They were so small, filthy, the nails torn and black with dirt. But Mama had taught him to keep them clean. She'd made him scrub them every night, even when they'd had no soap, even when the water was ice cold. A gentleman keeps his hands clean, she'd said, no matter what. Gentleman. He almost laughed, but it came out as a sob instead. Something inside him, some small flame that had kept burning through his mother's death, through the cold, through the hunger, guttered and nearly went out. What was he doing here? What had he thought would happen? That someone would simply open these gates for a starving child in rags? That anyone behind those golden windows would care that he existed? The rain was falling harder now. It ran down his face, into his eyes, his mouth. He couldn't tell anymore where the rain stopped and his tears began. He should leave, find a barn somewhere, a doorway, anywhere out of this wind. But his body wouldn't move. His legs had finally given out. The cold had sunk so deep into his bones that even shivering felt like too much effort. So he stayed there, kneeling in the mud at the gates of Ashford Park, his mother's final words echoing in a mind that was starting to go soft and distant with exhaustion. Tell him who you are. He lifted his head one last time and looked through the iron bars at the impossible house beyond, at the lights that blurred and swam in his failing vision, at the life that existed behind those walls, a life of warmth and safety and full bellies, a life he would never touch. His lips moved, forming words too quiet for anyone to hear. I'm your son. Then the darkness folded over him, and he fell forward into the mud and knew nothing more. The Duke of Ashford did not believe in providence. He believed in ledgers that balanced, in contracts honored, in the mathematical certainty of cause and effect. which was why, at 7:30 on a November evening, he was reviewing estate accounts in his study rather than attending Lady Pemberton's musicale in town, an event that promised nothing but tepid wine and daughters paraded before him like livestock at market. The sound, when it came, was so faint he almost missed it beneath the rain battering the windows. A voice, small, distant. He lifted his head, pen poised above a column of figures that suddenly seemed irrelevant. Listened. Nothing, only the storm. He returned to the accounts, but his hand remained still. The sensation that something was wrong, that peculiar tightening at the base of his skull that had kept him alive on battlefields in Portugal, would not release him. The voice came again, weaker this time, a single word he couldn't make out, swallowed by wind and rain. Alexander Thorne, 7th Duke of Ashford, set down his pen with the precise care he applied to all things, stood, crossed to the window that overlooked the front approach. Darkness, rain, the drive a river of black water. Then, movement at the gates. Something low to the ground, pale against the iron, too small to be a man. He was out of the study before conscious thought caught up with instinct. His butler, Matthews, appeared in the hall as if summoned by thought alone. Your Grace. The gates, someone's there. Alexander was already striding toward the entrance, Matthews trailing behind with a lamp that cast wild shadows across the marble walls. At this hour, in this weather, surely not. Open them. The command cut through Matthew's protest. The butler knew that tone. Every servant in the household knew it. The Duke gave orders once and expected them executed without question. By the time Alexander reached the front entrance, 2 footmen were already running toward the gates with lanterns held high against the storm. He followed, rain soaking through his dinner jacket within seconds, plastering his dark hair to his skull. He didn't care. The footmen reached the gates first. One of them, William, the younger one, went very still. My God. Alexander pushed between them. A child lay crumpled in the gravel like a broken doll, face down, unmoving, so small that for one terrible moment Alexander thought they'd found a corpse. Then the boy's ribs expanded, shallow, barely there but breathing. Get him inside, Alexander's voice came out harder than he'd intended. Now. William bent to lift the child, but Alexander was already moving, already kneeling in the mud and gravel, already gathering the impossibly light body into his arms. The boy's skin was ice. His clothes, what remained of them, were sodden rags that dripped mud and rainwater. The walk back to the house felt endless. In the entrance hall, Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper who'd served his family for 30 years and feared nothing except God and unpaid accounts, took one look at the child and went pale. Dear Lord, is he alive? Barely. Alexander laid the boy on the settee in the drawing room, heedless of the expensive damask that would be ruined by mud and water. Send for Dr. Whitmore, immediately, and bring blankets, warm water, broth if we have it. The household erupted into controlled chaos. Servants scattered to their tasks. Matthews built up the fire to a roaring blaze. Mrs. Hartley returned with an armful of blankets and began stripping away the boy's ruined clothing with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd raised 6 children of her own. Alexander should have left, should have returned to his study, should have delegated this unexpected disruption to his staff, and resumed the life of careful order he'd built in the 5 years since he'd returned from war. Instead, he found himself kneeling beside the settee, watching Mrs. Hartley work. The boy was perhaps 7, perhaps younger, starvation made it hard to tell. His hair, once cleaned of mud, proved to be dark, nearly black. His face was all sharp angles, the bones too prominent beneath skin gone translucent with cold and hunger. But it was the resemblance that stopped Alexander's breath in his chest. No, it wasn't possible. Yet there it was, undeniable, even in the child's unconscious face. The shape of the jaw, the high cheekbones, the slight cleft in the chin that Alexander saw every morning in his shaving mirror. Your Grace, Mrs. Hartley's voice seemed to come from very far away. Shall I send someone to the parish to inquire if anyone's missing a child? Alexander couldn't look away from the boy's face. Dark lashes against pale cheeks. A mouth that even in unconsciousness held a certain firmness, a stubborn set that spoke of pride worn thin but not yet broken. He knew that pride, had seen it once before in another face, a lifetime ago. No, the word came out rougher than he'd intended. He cleared his throat. Not yet, let him wake first. Let him tell us who he is. Mrs. Hartley's eyes narrowed with the particular shrewdness of a woman who'd known him since he was in short pants. But she only nodded. As you say, Your Grace. Dr. Whitmore arrived 20 minutes later, examined the boy with grave efficiency, and pronounced him suffering from exhaustion, exposure, and prolonged hunger, but likely to survive with warmth and care. Someone's been searching for food scraps for days, perhaps weeks, the doctor said, packing his instruments. The stomach is badly cramped. He'll need to eat slowly when he wakes. Small amounts, nothing rich. When, not if. Alexander felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched tight. The doctor left. The servants dispersed to their evening duties. The house settled into its usual nighttime quiet, broken only by rain against windows and the crack of logs in the fire. Alexander remained. He pulled a chair close to the settee and sat, watching the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest beneath the blankets, watching the color gradually return to those hollow cheeks, watching and trying very hard not to see what his mind kept insisting was there. The resemblance. The impossible, undeniable resemblance. He thought of a summer 8 years ago. A woman with gentle hands and fierce eyes. A month of stolen moments in the rose garden before his father's summons to London, before duty and expectation had pulled him back into the life he'd been born to live. He'd returned to find her gone. Dismissed, the housekeeper had said, some trouble with missing silver. His father had been firm, such matters were beneath a duke's concern. Alexander had been too young, too weak, too obedient to question it. And now this child lay before him, carrying a face that made a mockery of 8 years' silence. The boy's eyelids flickered. Alexander leaned forward. You're safe, he said quietly. The first words he'd speak to this child who almost certainly. No, not yet, not until he knew for certain. You're safe now, he repeated. No one will hurt you here. The boy's eyes opened, dark, confused, terrified. And in them, Alexander saw the truth he'd been trying to deny. He saw her, clear as daylight. He saw a leaner. The boy woke to softness. That was the first shock. Not pain, not cold, not the gnawing ache in his belly that had been his constant companion for longer than he could remember. Just softness. Clean linen against his skin. A pillow beneath his head that smelled faintly of lavender. Warmth so complete and enveloping that for a confused moment he thought he must be dead, and this was what heaven felt like. Then his eyes opened, and he knew he wasn't dead at all. The room was larger than the entire attic where he'd lived with his mother. Pale blue walls, white molding that caught the morning light. A window, an actual glass window, not shuttered or broken, through which he could see a garden with hedges trimmed into perfect geometric shapes. He sat up too quickly, the room tilted, his stomach lurched. A hand, warm, firm, smelling of rosewater and bread, pressed gently against his shoulder. Slowly, child, you'll make yourself sick. He turned his head to find a woman sitting in a chair beside the bed. She was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her dress was black bombazine, crisp and proper, but her eyes were kind. Where? His voice came out as a croak. His throat was raw, as if he'd been screaming, though he had no memory of it. Ashford Park. The woman reached for a glass of water on the bedside table. Drink, small sips. He took the glass with both hands. They were clean, he noticed with shock, the dirt scrubbed away, the nails trimmed, and drank. The water was cool and pure and the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. I'm Mrs. Hartley, the woman said. I'm the housekeeper here, and you, young man, gave us quite a fright last night. Last night, the memory came back in fragments. Rain, gates, falling, a voice in the darkness saying you're safe. The Duke, he said suddenly. I need to see, I have to tell him. The Duke is aware you're here. Mrs. Hartley's tone was carefully neutral. He's requested that you rest and recover before any conversations take place. She stood, smoothing her skirts with the automatic gesture of a woman who'd spent her life in service. I'll have breakfast sent up. Nothing heavy, your stomach won't tolerate it yet. Toast and weak tea to start. I don't want charity. The words came out sharper than he'd intended, but he couldn't call them back. Wouldn't call them back. Mama had taught him better than to accept handouts like a beggar. Mrs. Hartley's eyebrows rose. Charity, child, you collapsed at our gates. Common decency demands we feed you, or would you prefer we'd left you in the rain? Heat flooded his face. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean. He stopped, struggling for words. Thank you for the kindness, but I won't impose. Longer than necessary. Something shifted in the housekeeper's expression, a softening around the eyes. What's your name? He hesitated. Mama had told him to reveal himself to the Duke, but she'd never said whether he should tell anyone else. And the truth, if Mama had been right about who his father was, seemed too enormous, too impossible to speak aloud. Thomas, he said finally, it was true enough. Thomas Edward, his mother had named him, the Edward for a father he'd never known. Well then, Thomas, Mrs. Hartley moved toward the door. You rest, I'll return shortly with breakfast. And perhaps, she added with the ghost of a smile, we'll find you some proper clothes. Those rags you arrived in are fit only for burning. She left him alone in the beautiful room with its soft bed and clean windows, and the crushing weight of not knowing what came next. The breakfast, when it arrived on a silver tray carried by a maid who couldn't have been much older than 14, was exactly as promised. Toast, weak tea, and a small pot of honey that gleamed like amber in the morning light. Thomas ate slowly, fighting the urge to wolf it down. His stomach cramped and protested even the small amounts, but he forced himself to chew carefully, to wait between bites the way Mama had taught him when food was scarce and had to last. The maid, she'd introduced herself as Lucy, lingered by the door, watching him with frank curiosity. You really walked all the way from London? She asked. He paused mid-bite. How did you know I came from London? Mrs. Hartley said your accent placed you there, and? Lucy hesitated. Forgive me, but you looked half-starved. People don't get that way in a day or two. Thomas set down his toast. My mother died, in Cheapside. I had nowhere else to go. The girl's face crumpled with sympathy. Oh, that's dreadful. I'm ever so sorry. He didn't want her pity, didn't want anyone's pity, but something in Lucy's open, honest face made the sharp words die on his tongue. She was a good mother, he said instead. She taught me things, reading, music, Latin even. Lucy's eyes widened. Latin truly. Veritas numquam perit, Thomas said quietly. Truth never perishes, she made me memorize it. Goodness? Lucy shook her head in wonder. My brother's at the village school, and he can barely manage his letters. Your mother must have been a lady. She was, Thomas's throat tightened, once before. He couldn't finish. Before what? Before whatever had happened to cast her out, to reduce her to taking in mending in a freezing attic, to dying alone except for a 7-year-old boy who couldn't save her. Lucy seemed to sense his distress. I'll leave you to finish eating, she said gently. But if you need anything, you just ring that bell by the bed. Mrs. Hartley says you're to be treated as a guest. After she left, Thomas sat very still, staring at the remains of his breakfast. A guest. He didn't belong here. Even cleaned up, even in borrowed nightclothes that were softer than anything he'd ever worn, he was still a beggar's child. A nobody. Unless Mama had been telling the truth. Unless the Duke really was. The door opened without warning. Thomas looked up, half expecting Mrs. Hartley with more instructions about rest and proper recovery. Instead, the Duke stood in the doorway. He was tall, taller than Thomas remembered from the confused blur of last night. Perhaps 40, though it was hard to tell. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that might have been handsome if it weren't so carefully controlled, so deliberately expressionless. He wore a dark coat and buff breeches, every line immaculate, every detail precise. But it was his eyes that caught Thomas. Gray, steady, looking at him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. You're awake. The Duke's voice was deep, clipped. A gentleman's accent, but with something underneath, some roughness that spoke of battlefields and hard years. Good. Dr. Whitmore said you'd likely sleep through the day. Thomas scrambled to sit straighter, nearly knocking over the tea tray in his haste. Your Grace, I need to tell you something. My mother, she said, she told me before she died. Not yet. The Duke crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clasped behind his back like a general inspecting troops. First, you'll answer my questions. Truthfully, do you understand? Thomas nodded, his heart hammering. Your mother's name. Eleanor, his voice wavered. Eleanor Ashton. Something flickered across the Duke's face, so brief Thomas might have imagined it. And her occupation. She was a governess before I was born. She taught children in great houses. Thomas swallowed hard. She said she worked here 8 years ago before she was dismissed. The silence that followed was so complete Thomas could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. The Duke's jaw tightened. Why was she dismissed? Someone accuse. Her of theft. She said it was a lie. She said she never. It was a lie. The words were quiet but absolute. The Duke turned away, walked to the window, stood with his back to Thomas as if he couldn't bear to look at him. I didn't know, the Duke said, his voice rough. I was in London. My father managed the household. When I returned, she was simply gone. He told me she'd been caught stealing silver, that she'd left in disgrace before charges could be brought. She didn't steal anything. Thomas's hands clenched in the bedsheets. She wouldn't. She was honest. She was good. I know. The Duke turned back, and this time Thomas could see it clearly. The pain in those gray eyes, the regret, the terrible recognition. You have her eyes, the Duke said quietly. Her mouth, the way you hold your head when you're angry, that's hers too. I'd know it anywhere. Thomas's breath caught. Then you knew her, really knew her. Yes, the word was barely a whisper. I knew her, I loved her, and I failed her in every possible way. The admission hung between them, like something alive and terrible. Your Grace. Alexander, the Duke's voice was hoarse. My name is Alexander, and if Alina told you to come here if she sent you to find me, he stopped, drew a breath. Then I think we both know why. Thomas nodded slowly, his throat too tight for words. You're my son, the Duke, Alexander said, not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the same precision he likely used for estate accounts and military orders. Aren't you? Yes, sir, Thomas lifted his chin, forcing himself to meet those gray eyes. I think I am. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Father and son. Strangers bound by blood and loss, and a woman who died before she could see them reconciled. Then Alexander moved, crossed to the bed, sat carefully on the edge, close enough that Thomas could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. Mrs. Hartley will prepare a proper room for you, Alexander said quietly. Not guest quarters, a family room, in the east wing where my chambers are. You'll have tutors, proper clothes, everything you need. I don't want charity, Thomas said again, but this time without heat. It's not charity. Alexander's mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. It's restitution. It's 8 years too late, and nowhere near enough to make amends for what your mother suffered, but it's what I can offer. He stood, straightened his coat, the controlled Duke reasserting itself over the grieving man. Rest today, he said. Tomorrow we'll talk more, about your mother, about what comes next, about— He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, about everything I should have done differently. Then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone in the soft bed with the silver tray, and the impossible, terrifying knowledge that his life had just changed forever. Outside the room, Alexander stood in the hallway, his forehead pressed against the cool wall, fighting for control. Elinor. God, Elinor. Dead, gone, and he'd never known, never even thought to inquire what had become of her after his father's lies had driven her away. A door opened down the hall. Mrs. Hartley emerged, took one look at his face, and said nothing. She'd been with his family long enough to know when silence was kindness. The boy stays, Alexander said without looking at her. Permanently? I'll send word to London, to my solicitors. I want Elinor Ashton's name cleared. I want to know who made that accusation, and I want them held accountable. Your Grace, Mrs. Hartley's voice was gentle. If you acknowledge the boy publicly, there will be talk. Let them talk. Your stepmother will hear of it. Lady Catherine has never been understanding of complications. Ah yes, Catherine. His father's second wife, who'd married into the title 3 years after Alexander's mother died, who'd spent the past decade trying to manage him like one of her charitable projects. Catherine, who'd been living in the main house 8 years ago when Elinor had been dismissed. Alexander straightened. Mrs. Hartley, who was housekeeper here when Miss Ashton was employed. Mrs. Dawson, she retired 5 years ago, lives in the village now. I want to speak with her tomorrow. He turned to face the housekeeper fully. Someone accused Elinor Ashton of theft. Someone orchestrated her dismissal while I was away. I want to know who. Mrs. Hartley's expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held understanding. I'll send word to Mrs. Dawson, she said, Your Grace. Mrs. Dawson's cottage smelled of dried lavender and old memories. Alexander sat in a chair too small for his frame, teacup balanced on his knee, while the former housekeeper moved about her tiny parlor with the careful slowness of a woman whose bones had begun to betray her. She was 70 if she was a day, white-haired and bent, but her eyes were sharp as ever. I wondered when you'd come asking, she said finally, settling into her own chair with a soft grunt. Took you long enough. You knew, Alexander's hand tightened on the teacup. About Alina, about what happened. I knew she was innocent. Mrs. Dawson's mouth pressed into a thin line. I knew the silver teapot that went missing turned up 3 weeks later in Lady Catherine's private sitting room. I knew your father refused to hear a word of explanation before he cast that girl out. The words hit like physical blows. Why didn't you tell me? Alexander's voice came out harder than he'd intended. When I returned from London, why didn't you? You think I didn't try? The old woman's eyes flashed. I went to your father the day after Miss Ashton left, told him everything. He said the matter was closed, and if I valued my position, I'd keep my mouth shut about it. Said a duke's household couldn't afford scandal. So you stayed silent. I had 8 grandchildren to feed. Mrs. Dawson's voice cracked. I'm not proud of it, Your Grace, but I was 65 and too old to find new employment. So yes, I stayed silent, and I've regretted it every day since. Alexander set down his teacup before he could crush it. Who placed the teapot in Catherine's room? Lady Catherine herself, I'd wager, though I never saw it happen. Mrs. Dawson leaned forward. But I can tell you this, your stepmother took a particular dislike to Miss Ashton from the moment she arrived. Said she was too educated for her station. Said she gave herself airs. Alina didn't give herself airs, Alexander said quietly. She simply refused to pretend she was less intelligent than she was. And that threatened a woman like Lady Catherine. The former housekeeper's expression softened. Your Grace, the boy who came to your gates, is he. He's Alina's son and mine. The words still felt strange on his tongue. Foreign, true. She sent him to me before she died. She must have known. She must have wanted. He couldn't finish. Mrs. Dawson reached across the small space between their chairs and patted his hand with her papery fingers. She wanted her boy safe. Whatever else happened, whatever lies were told, she knew you weren't the type to turn away a child in need. I turned her away. The admission burned like acid. I believed my father's lies. I never even questioned. You were 22 and freshly returned from war. Mrs. Dawson's tone was firm. You weren't the man you are now, and your father? She sighed. He was a hard man, Your Grace. Harder still after your mother passed. He wanted you married to advantage, settled with heirs. A romance with the governess didn't fit his plans. Alexander stood, paced to the window. Outside, the November afternoon was gray and still, the kind of day that felt like the world was holding its breath. I need to ask Thomas about his mother, he said, about what she told him, about everything. Be gentle with the boy, Mrs. Dawson's voice followed him. He's lost the only person who loved him. Don't make him relive it unless you must. Thomas was in the library when Alexander found him. The boy sat curled in a leather wingback chair far too large for his small frame, a book open on his lap. He looked up when Alexander entered, and something in his expression, wariness mixed with hope, made Alexander's chest ache. May I join you? Alexander asked. Thomas nodded, closing the book carefully. Alexander saw the title as the boy set it aside. Paradise Lost. Heavy reading for a 7-year-old, but then Alina had never believed in underestimating children. Alexander took the chair opposite. For a long moment, neither spoke. I spoke with Mrs. Dawson today, Alexander said finally. The woman who was housekeeper here when your mother worked for my family. She confirmed what you told me. Alina was innocent. The theft accusation was false. Thomas's jaw tightened. Mama said people believe lies more easily than truth. She said lies are more comfortable because they let people avoid being wrong. Your mother was wise. She was, the boy's voice wavered slightly. She was everything. Alexander leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Thomas, I need to ask you some questions about your mother, about her life after she left here. I know it's painful, but you want to know why she never told you about me. The directness of it caught Alexander off guard. He'd forgotten how children could cut straight to the heart of things without the layering of adult pretense. Yes, he admitted, among other things. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his small hands folded in his lap with a composure that seemed far too old for his years. She tried, he said finally. When she first knew she was carrying me, she wrote you a letter. Alexander's breath stopped. I never received any letter. I know, she said it was returned unopened, with a note from your father saying you were engaged to be married, and all correspondence from former servants would be burned unread. The room tilted. Engaged. Yes, that had been the summer of 1816. His father had been negotiating with the Earl of Hartwick, pushing for a match with Lady Caroline. A match that had fallen through when the Earl died suddenly and Caroline married a Portuguese count instead. But Alina wouldn't have known that, she would have thought. She believed I'd moved on, Alexander said, the words like gravel in his throat. She thought I'd forgotten her. She never said that. Thomas's voice was small but steady. She said you'd had responsibilities, that you were a duke's son and she was nobody. She said she understood. She shouldn't have had to understand. Alexander stood abruptly, crossed to the window, pressed his forehead against the cold glass. She should have been here, you both should have been here, if I'd known, if I'd just questioned my father's word. She didn't want me to hate you. The quiet statement brought Alexander around. Thomas was watching him with those dark eyes, Alina's eyes, filled with a gravity no child should possess. Even when things were hardest, the boy continued, when we had nothing, when she was taking in mending for pennies and we were living in that freezing room in Cheapside, even then she never said a bad word about you. She said you'd been kind to her. She said you'd made her laugh. She said, his voice cracked. She said I had your stubbornness and your sense of honor, and those were good things to inherit from a father. Alexander felt something break open in his chest. Grief, yes, guilt, certainly. But underneath it all, a terrible gratitude that Alina had been generous enough, even in poverty and abandonment, to give their son a father he could respect rather than despise. Tell me about her last days, he said quietly, if you can bear it. Thomas's hands clenched in his lap, but he nodded. She got sick 3 weeks ago, a cough that wouldn't stop. She kept working, we needed the money, but she got weaker. Then one morning she couldn't get out of bed. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I tried to help her. I brought water. I begged the landlady to send for a doctor, but she said we owed rent, and until it was paid, we could manage on our own. How long? Alexander's voice was rough. 5 days, she held on for 5 days. Thomas's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down his cheeks. She was so cold. I gave her every blanket we had, but she just kept shaking. And on the last morning, she took my hand and she told me to come here. She said, find the Duke, tell him who you are, he'll keep you safe. The boy's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides, knelt before the chair and gathered his son, into his arms. Thomas stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against him, crying with the terrible abandon of a child who'd been holding everything inside for far too long. I'm sorry, Alexander whispered into the boy's dark hair. I'm so sorry, for your mother, for everything you've suffered, for not being there when you needed me. They stayed like that, father and son, strangers bound by grief and blood, until Thomas's sobs quieted to hiccups and then to silence. Subscribe now if you want to see what happens when the person who destroyed this family learns that Thomas has survived. Because the villain never expected the child to make it to the Duke's gates alive, and she won't rest until he's gone for good. That evening, Alexander sat in his study with a decanter of brandy and a letter he'd begun writing a dozen times without finishing. Catherine, I require your presence at Ashford Park at your earliest convenience. There are matters concerning the household that demand your immediate attention and explanation. Alexander. He stared at the words, too formal, too cold, not nearly cold enough. He crumpled the letter and started again. Catherine, you will come to Ashford Park within the week. We need to discuss Alina Ashton and the lies you told my father 8 years ago. Better, direct, unmistakable. He sealed it with wax, rang for Matthews, and handed over the letter with instructions for immediate dispatch to Lady Catherine's London residence. Then he poured himself 2 fingers of brandy and stood at the window, looking out over the darkened grounds. Somewhere in this house his son was sleeping, safe, fed, protected. But for how long? Catherine was many things: calculating, ambitious, ruthlessly protective of her position in society. She would not take kindly to the appearance of an illegitimate heir, would not tolerate a threat to the careful social standing she'd cultivated. And if she'd been willing to destroy Alina 8 years ago, to remove an inconvenient romance, what would she do now to protect herself from exposure? Alexander set down his glass with a soft click. He would need to be ready, because Catherine was coming. And she would not come quietly. Lady Catherine Thorne arrived at Ashford Park 4 days later in a burgundy traveling coach, accompanied by two maids, a mountain of luggage, and an air of barely suppressed fury. Alexander watched from the study window as she descended from the carriage, with the precise, controlled movements of a woman who'd spent her life mastering the performance of aristocratic grace. She was handsome rather than beautiful, sharp features, iron gray hair arranged in severe curls, a spine so straight it might have been reinforced with steel. She'd been his stepmother for 15 years. He'd never trusted her for a single day of them. Matthews announced her arrival precisely 20 minutes later, giving Catherine just enough time to refresh herself and arrange her attack. She swept into the study without waiting for invitation. Alexander, no, your grace. No pretense of formal courtesy. They'd dispensed with such niceties years ago. I received your letter. What is this nonsense about Alina Ashton? It's not nonsense. Alexander remained behind his desk, a deliberate positioning that kept the mahogany expanse between them like a battlefield. A child arrived at my gates a week ago. Alina's son, my son, the boy you made certain would never be born into this family. Catherine's expression didn't flicker. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't insult me with denials. Alexander's voice was ice. Mrs. Dawson has confirmed everything: the false theft accusation, the silver teapot that miraculously appeared in your sitting room weeks after Alina was dismissed, the letter I wrote to Alina that you intercepted and returned unopened. Mrs. Dawson is a bitter old woman with too much time to invent grievances. Then you won't mind when I make this matter public, when I acknowledge Thomas as my son and heir, when I make it known that Alina Ashton was falsely accused and that certain members of this household conspired to destroy an innocent woman. That landed, Catherine's fingers tightened on her reticule. You cannot be serious. Her voice dropped to something dangerous. You would claim a base-born child, acknowledge him publicly? Alexander, think of what you're doing, the scandal. The only scandal is that an innocent woman was cast out while pregnant and left to die in poverty. Alexander stood. Thomas stays. He'll be educated as befits my son. He'll take the Thorne name. And you, Catherine, will explain to me exactly why you hated Alina Ashton enough to destroy her. Catherine was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was calm, reasonable, which made it all the more chilling. Because she was going to ruin you, Catherine said. A governess, Alexander. A nobody with no family, no fortune, no connections. Your father was negotiating an advantageous match, a match that would have secured the estate's financial future. And you were ready to throw it all away for a pretty face and some romantic nonsense about love. That wasn't your decision to make. Someone had to make it. Your father was too weak to act decisively. He dithered, worried about your feelings. Catherine's lip curled. So I acted. I created a situation that made her dismissal inevitable. I made sure she understood she had no place here, and I ensured she could never return to complicate your life. The casual admission of it, the complete lack of remorse, made Alexander's hands clench into fists. She was pregnant. I didn't know that at the time, though I suspected. Catherine shrugged. It doesn't change the fundamental calculation. She was unsuitable. The problem had to be removed. She was a person, a woman I loved. Love is a luxury for poets and fools. You're a duke. You have responsibilities. Get out. The words were quiet, absolute. Catherine stared at him. Excuse me. You heard me. Pack your things. You're no longer welcome at Ashford Park. I'll make arrangements for your dower house in Yorkshire. You'll leave by week's end. You cannot exile me. I'm family. You destroyed my family. Alexander's voice cracked like a whip. You drove away the woman I loved and condemned her to poverty and death. You denied my son his birthright. You did this for what? Social positioning? Money? The preservation of your own influence. I did this for the estate? Catherine's composure finally shattered. For the Thorn legacy, for everything your family has built over generations, and you want to throw it all away for a dead woman and her bastard. The study door opened. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face white, his small body trembling. The silence was deafening. Thomas, Alexander's voice gentled instantly. How long have you been? Long enough, the boy's voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I was looking for you and I heard voices and. He looked at Catherine with something close to horror. Catherine looked back with cold assessment. So this is a leaner. Swelp, she said. He has her eyes pity. They were always too knowing for her own good. Get out. Alexander was around the desk in seconds, positioning himself between his son and his stepmother. Now. Oh, I'll leave. Catherine gathered her reticule with deliberate care. But understand this, Alexander, if you acknowledge this boy publicly, I will make certain every drawing room in London knows the full story. The governess who seduced a duke's son, the illegitimate child born in a Cheapside slum, the scandal that will make you and your heir social pariahs. She moved toward the door, paused beside Thomas. Nothing personal, child, she said pleasantly. But you should have stayed in whatever gutter your mother birthed you in. It would have been kinder for everyone. Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the marble hall. Thomas stood frozen, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Thomas, Alexander reached for him. She's right, the boy's voice cracked. I shouldn't have come here, I'm ruining everything. Your reputation, your standing, she's going to destroy you because of me. No, Alexander knelt, gripped the boy's shoulders firmly. Listen to me. Catherine can say whatever she likes. Let her talk. Let all of London talk. You are my son, you belong here, and I will not lose you the way I lost your mother. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, but the scandal will pass, scandals always do. But a son? Alexander's voice roughened. A son is forever, and I've already failed you once by not being there when you needed me. I won't fail you again. Your Grace, Matthews appeared in the doorway, his usual composure slightly ruffled. I apologize for the interruption, but there's a woman here to see you. She says it's urgent, says she has information about Miss Eleanor Ashton. Alexander and Thomas exchanged glances. Show her in, Alexander said. The woman who entered was perhaps 60, thin and nervous, wearing the black dress of an upper servant. She twisted her hands in her apron, eyes darting between Alexander and Thomas. Your Grace, she said, her voice trembling, I'm Mrs. Porter. I was lady's maid to your late mother, and then to Lady Catherine after your mother passed. I remember you, Alexander said. You left service 5 years ago. Your Grace, I did. Mrs. Porter drew a shaky breath. I left because I couldn't bear what I knew any longer, what I'd seen and stayed silent about. She reached into her apron and withdrew a folded letter, yellowed with age. I was in Lady Catherine's room the day she intercepted your letter to Miss Ashton, Mrs. Porter said. The letter where you told Miss Ashton you loved her and asked her to wait for you. Lady Catherine burned it, but she didn't know I'd already copied it in my journal. I used to copy all her correspondence as part of my duties, in case anything needed to be referenced later. She held out the letter with shaking hands. I also saw her place the silver teapot in her own sitting room, Mrs. Porter continued, words tumbling out now in a rush. And I heard her tell your father that Miss Ashton must be dismissed immediately or the girl would trap you into marriage. I heard everything, Your Grace. And I stayed silent because I was afraid. But when I heard a child had come to your gates, when I heard Lady Catherine had been summoned, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Alexander took the letter, unfolded it carefully. His own handwriting stared back at him. Words he'd written 8 years ago, thinking they'd reach Eleanor. Promises he'd made that she'd never seen. My dearest Eleanor, wait for me, I'll find a way. I swear on everything I hold sacred, I'll find a way for us to be together. His vision blurred. Thank you, he said hoarsely. Mrs. Porter, you cannot know what this means. I know I should have spoken sooner. The woman's eyes were bright with tears. I know I failed that poor girl, failed you both, but I'm speaking now. And if you need me to testify against Lady Catherine, to tell anyone who will listen what I saw, I'll do it. I'll tell the truth, consequences be damned. Thomas stepped forward, his small voice clear in the sudden quiet. Veritas numquam perit, he said softly. Mrs. Porter looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's right, child, she whispered. Truth never perishes. Even when we try to bury it, it finds a way to rise again. Alexander called for a formal gathering 3 days later. Not a private family matter handled behind closed doors, but a public reckoning. He invited the local magistrate, Sir Edmund Hartwell, the vicar, Reverend Thompson, Mrs. Dawson, despite her age and the difficulty of travel, every senior member of his household staff, and three of the most prominent families in the county, people whose opinions shaped society for 50 miles in every direction. Catherine objected, of course. "This is absurd," she hissed at him the morning of the gathering. "You're making us a spectacle. Whatever grievances you have with me can be handled privately." You forfeited privacy when you chose to destroy an innocent woman's life. Alexander's tone was ice. You wanted to protect the family reputation? Then you'll face what you've done in front of the very society you claim to serve. The magistrate, the vicar, Alexander, you're inviting judgment upon this house. No, I'm inviting truths. He turned away from her, done with argument, and went to find Thomas. The boy was in his room, dressed in new clothes that Mrs. Hartley had commissioned from the village tailor, a proper suit in dark blue wool, a crisp white shirt, a waistcoat that made him look older than his 7 years. But his face was pale, his hands shaking as he tried to fasten his collar. "Let me," Alexander knelt and did up the button with gentle fingers. "There." "I'm frightened," Thomas whispered. "I know. What if they don't believe us? What if they think I'm lying? What if—" "Thomas," Alexander cupped the boy's face in his hands, "you're not on trial here. Catherine is. All you need to do is stand beside me and let the truth speak for itself. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, though his eyes remained wide with fear. "Good lad," Alexander stood. "Whatever happens in that room, remember this, you have every right to be here. You're my son, and nothing anyone says can change that." The drawing room had been arranged like a courtroom. Chairs in rows facing a central space where two high-backed seats had been positioned, one for Alexander, one empty and clearly intended for Catherine. Sir Edmund Hartwell sat to the right, the magistrate's official ledger open on his lap. Reverend Thompson occupied a chair to the left, his expression grave and troubled. The other guests filled the remaining seats, a small audience of perhaps 20 people whose collective judgment would determine not just Catherine's fate, but Thomas's future in this society. Alexander entered first, Thomas's small hand clasped firmly in his own. He felt the boy's fingers trembling but held on tighter, silently promising protection. The room fell silent. Lady Catherine arrived moments later, her bearing imperious despite the circumstances. She took her seat with the air of a queen, granting an audience rather than a woman facing accusations. Sir Edmund cleared his throat. "Your Grace, you've called this gathering to address certain irregularities concerning events that occurred on this estate 8 years ago. Is that correct?" "It is." Alexander remained standing, Thomas beside him. 8 years ago, a young woman named Eleanor Ashton served as governess in this household. She was dismissed under accusation of theft, specifically, the stealing of a silver teapot from the family collection. She was cast out without references, without wages owed, and without opportunity to defend herself. She subsequently died in poverty in London, leaving behind a 7-year-old son. He placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "This boy, my son, the child Eleanor carried when she was forced from this house." A murmur ran through the assembled guests. Catherine's expression remained carved from marble. Sir Edmund made a note in his ledger. "These are serious allegations, Your Grace. You claim the theft accusation was false." "I don't claim it, I can prove it." Alexander nodded to Matthews, who stepped forward carrying a wooden box. The butler opened it, revealing a silver teapot, tarnished with age but unmistakably part of the Ashford family collection. "This teapot," Alexander said, "was discovered 3 weeks after Eleanor's dismissal in Lady Catherine's private sitting room, by the housekeeper at the time, Mrs. Dawson." Mrs. Dawson stood, leaning heavily on her cane. "It's true, Sir Edmund. I found it myself, tucked behind a panel in her ladyship's escritoire. When I reported it to the late Duke, he told me to keep silent. Said the matter was closed and stirring it up would only cause more trouble." Catherine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "Mrs. Dawson," Sir Edmund said carefully, "you're stating under oath that you found the allegedly stolen item in Lady Catherine's possession." "I am." "And you said nothing." "To my shame, sir, I did not. I was afraid of losing my position. The old woman's voice cracked. I've regretted my silence every day since. Reverend Thompson leaned forward. Your Grace, even if the theft accusation was false, that doesn't necessarily prove the child's parentage. How can you be certain? I can answer that, Reverend. All heads turned. Mrs. Porter stood, her hands clasped tightly before her. She looked terrified but determined. I was Lady Catherine's personal maid 8 years ago, she said. I was present when her ladyship intercepted a letter from His Grace to Miss Ashton. A letter expressing his love and asking her to wait for him while he settled matters with his father. She drew the copied letter from her pocket and handed T to Sir Edmund with shaking hands. Lady Catherine burned the original, Mrs. Porter continued, but I'd already transcribed it as part of my regular duties, and I heard her ladyship tell the late Duke that Miss Ashton must be removed from the household immediately before she could trap His Grace into an unsuitable marriage. This is absurd. Catherine's voice cut through the room like a blade. The ramblings of dismissed servants nursing old grudges. Sir Edmund, surely you can see. I also witnessed Lady Catherine place the silver teapot in her own sitting room, Mrs. Porter said, her voice growing stronger. 2 days before Miss Ashton was accused of its theft. I saw it with my own eyes. The room erupted in whispers. Catherine stood abruptly. These women are liars. They've clearly conspired together to manufacture this fiction. Then explain the letter. Alexander's voice cut through the noise. Explain why Mrs. Porter has a word-for-word copy of correspondence I wrote 8 years ago. Explain how she could know details of a letter I never thought anyone but a leaner would read. He took the transcription from Sir Edmund and read aloud. My dearest Eleanor, I know my father opposes our attachment, but I will not be moved from it. You have shown me what it means to value a person for their mind and character rather than their birth and fortune. Wait for me. I'll find a way. I swear on everything I hold sacred, I'll find a way for us to be together. His voice roughened on the last words. He cleared his throat. I wrote those words, he said quietly. In my own hand, in this very house. Eleanor never received them because Catherine made certain of it. She intercepted my letters. She fabricated the theft. She orchestrated Eleanor's destruction because she deemed a governess unworthy of a duke's son. He turned to face Catherine fully. And when Eleanor left, pregnant with my child, though I didn't know it, you condemned both her and Thomas to a life of poverty that ultimately killed her. All to protect the family reputation. All to ensure I married suitably. Catherine's composure finally cracked. You were going to throw everything away, for her, a nobody with no family, no fortune. She was everything, the words came from Thomas. The boy stepped forward, his small voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. My mother was everything, Thomas repeated, looking directly at Catherine. She was kind, she was brilliant, she taught me to read and write and think. She worked until her hands bled to keep us fed. And even when she was dying, even after everything you did to her, she never taught me to hate. She taught me to value truth, to have dignity, to be better than the people who wronged us. He turned to face the assembled guests. I don't want revenge, he said simply. I just want people to know my mother was good, that she didn't deserve what happened to her, that she was innocent. The silence that followed was absolute. Reverend Thompson was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. Sir Edmund, he said quietly, I believe we've heard sufficient testimony. The accusation against Miss Ashton was clearly fabricated. The question now is what ought to be done about the person responsible. Sir Edmund nodded slowly, making notes in his ledger. Lady Catherine, you've been accused of bearing false witness, of theft through concealment, and of conspiracy to destroy an innocent woman's reputation and livelihood. These are serious charges. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Catherine stood frozen, her face white, her hands clenched at her sides. I did what I thought necessary, she said finally. Her voice was cold, but underneath it, Alexander heard the first tremor of fear. I acted in what I believed to be the family's best interest. By destroying an innocent woman, Mrs. Dawson's voice shook with anger. By condemning a child to starvation. I didn't know about the child. You didn't care to know? The old housekeeper struck her cane against the floor. You saw Miss Ashton as an obstacle and you removed her. You're fortunate she's not here to press charges herself, or you'd be facing worse than social disgrace. Sir Edmund closed his ledger with a soft thump. Lady Catherine, he said formally, while I cannot bring criminal charges for events that occurred 8 years ago without the victim present to testify, I can state for the record that the evidence presented here today thoroughly exonerates Miss Eleanor Ashton of any wrongdoing. Furthermore, I find the testimony regarding your role in these events to be credible and disturbing. He looked around the room at the assembled witnesses. Let it be known, he continued, that Eleanor Ashton was a woman of good character who was falsely accused and unjustly dismissed. Any rumors to the contrary are to be considered malicious slander. As for the child, he looked at Thomas with something like gentleness. If his Grace Cly MS the boy as his son and heir, I see no impediment to that claim. The resemblance alone would convince most reasonable people. Combined with the evidence of the intercepted letters and the timeline of events, I'd say the matter is settled. One by one, the assembled guests nodded their agreement. Lady Ashworth, the most influential matron in the county, stood. Your Grace, she said to Alexander, I knew your mother. She would have welcomed this child with open arms. As for Lady Catherine, she turned to deliver a look of withering contempt. I suggest she retire to her dower property. Immediately, before her presence here causes further embarrassment to this family. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree. When Lady Ashworth spoke, society listened. Catherine seemed to shrink before their eyes. The iron spine bent, the imperious mask crumbled. You're all fools, she said, but her voice held no conviction. Sentimental fools, taken in by a pretty story and a child's tears. No, Alexander said quietly. We're people who choose truth over convenience, something you've never understood. He gestured to Matthews. Please escort Lady Catherine to her rooms. She'll depart for Yorkshire in the morning. Catherine drew herself up one last time, grasping for the shreds of her dignity. This isn't over, Alexander. Yes, he said simply, it is. She left in silence, her footsteps echoing down the hall like a funeral march. The moment she was gone, the tension in the room broke like a fever. Guests began speaking in low, urgent tones. Lady Ashworth approached Thomas and smiled at him with genuine warmth. Welcome to the family, young man, she said. Your mother would be proud of how you conducted yourself today. Thomas nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Sir Edmund approached Alexander, extending his hand. Your Grace, I'll prepare formal documents exonerating Miss Ashton and recognizing the boy's legitimacy. They'll be filed with the county records by week's end. Thank you, Edmund. Slowly, the guests began to depart, each stopping to offer Alexander their support and to greet Thomas with varying degrees of warmth and curiosity. By the time the last carriage rolled down the drive, evening had fallen. Alexander and Thomas stood alone in the drawing room, the chairs now empty, the confrontation over. Thomas looked up at him, his young face exhausted but no longer afraid. Is it really finished? He asked. Yes, Alexander said, it's finished. The boy nodded slowly, then quite suddenly his legs buckled. Alexander caught him, lifted him easily into his arms. Thomas didn't protest, just laid his head against Alexander's shoulder with a sigh that seemed to carry weeks of tension. Mama would have liked this, Thomas murmured, half asleep already. She would have liked knowing the truth finally came out. She would have, Alexander agreed, his throat tight. He carried his son upstairs to bed, tucked him in with gentle hands, and sat beside him until sleep claimed the exhausted child. Only then, alone in the darkness, did Alexander allow himself to weep. For Eleanor, for the years lost, for the truth that had come too late to save her, but just in time to save their son. A week after the confrontation, on a morning when frost painted the windows with delicate crystals, Alexander found Thomas in the music room. The boy sat at the pianoforte, one finger pressing keys in a halting, uncertain melody. He stopped when Alexander entered, pulling his hands back as if he'd been caught doing something forbidden. I'm sorry, Thomas said quickly. Mrs. Hartley said it was all right to come in here, but I shouldn't have touched. Play, Alexander said, settling into a chair by the window. Please. Thomas hesitated, then returned his small hands to the keys. The melody resumed, simple, a bit clumsy but recognizable. A folk tune, the kind mothers sang to children at bedtime. She taught you, Alexander said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Thomas's fingers stumbled over a chord. She said music was something no one could take from you, that even if you lost everything else, you'd always have songs. Elinor's philosophy exactly: beauty as resistance, grace as defiance. Alexander listened until the melody ended, then rose and crossed to the piano. He sat beside Thomas on the bench, their shoulders nearly touching. May I? He placed his own hands on the keys. Thomas nodded, watching with wide eyes as Alexander played the same tune, fuller now, with proper harmonies, the way it was meant to sound. When he finished, he began again, this time leaving space for Thomas to join in with the melody. They played together, father and son, their hands moving across the same keys, creating something neither could have made alone. When the music faded, silence settled over the room like snowfall. Thomas, Alexander said carefully, not looking at the boy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly without worrying about W. Hat you think I want to hear? The boy's hand stilled on the keys. All right. Do you want to stay here, truly? Alexander turned to face him now. Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because you feel obligated, but because this is where you want to be. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his young face serious. I don't know, he said finally. I want to, but. But what? I don't want to be a burden. The words came out in a rush. You have your life here, your responsibilities, and I'm just a reminder of mistakes and sadness, of what you lost. Every time you look at me, you must think of her, of what happened, of. You're right. Thomas's head snapped up, hurt flashing across his face. Alexander continued, his voice rough but steady. Every time I look at you, I do think of your mother. I think of how she smiled when she was reading, how she argued with me about philosophy and never let me win just because I was a duke's son, how she made me laugh, how she made me want to be better than I was. He reached out, gently turned Thomas's face toward him. But I also see you, he said. Not just her reflection, you, a boy who walked for days in freezing rain to honor his mother's last wish, who stood in front of society's judgment and spoke with more courage than most men twice your age, who plays the piano badly but with feeling, which is better than playing it perfectly with none. A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's mouth at that last part. You're not a burden, Alexander said firmly. You're my son, and yes, there's grief in that, grief for the years I didn't know you, for the life your mother should have had, for everything that was stolen from all three of us. But there's also, he paused, searching for words. There's also joy, the kind I didn't know I was capable of feeling anymore. Thomas's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I failed your mother, Alexander continued. I was too young, too weak, too willing to believe comfortable lies rather than ask difficult questions. I let her down in every way that mattered, and I can never make that right. She's gone, and I'll carry that failure for the rest of my life. He gripped Thomas's shoulders gently. But I will not fail you, he said. I won't let fear or duty or society's expectations make me turn away from what I know is right. You belong here, with me. If you want to stay, truly want it, then this is your home. Forever, not as a guest, not as an obligation, as my son. Thomas's composure cracked, tears spilled down his cheeks. I want to stay, he whispered. I want to so much, but I'm frightened. Of what? That I won't be good enough, that I won't know how to be? He gestured helplessly at the grand room around them. This, a duke's son, I don't know which fork to use or how to dance or any of the things I'm supposed to know. I'm just me. Alexander felt something tighten and then release in his chest. Thomas, he said, and this time he pulled the boy into a proper embrace. Being you is exactly enough, more than enough. Everything else, the manners, the education, the social graces, those are just skills. They can be learned, but who you are, your courage, your honesty, your kindness even to people who have hurt you, that can't be taught. Your mother gave you that, and it's worth more than all the aristocratic training in England. Thomas buried his face against Alexander's shoulder and cried, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to carry weeks of fear and grief and exhausted hope. Alexander held him, one hand stroking the boy's dark hair, and waited. There was no rush, no schedule to keep, just this moment, this grief, this healing. When Thomas finally quieted, he pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I'd like to stay, sir, he said. His voice was steady now, certain. If you truly mean it, I'd like to stay and learn how to be your son. I mean it, Alexander smiled, a real smile, the first one that felt genuine in longer than he could remember. We'll learn together, I've never been anyone's father before. I'll probably make mistakes. Mama said everyone makes mistakes. She said the important thing is whether you try to fix them. She was right about that too. They sat together in the quiet music room, morning light streaming through the frost-painted windows, the pianoforte silent but still resonating with the melody they'd played together. There's something else I need to tell you, Alexander said. I've spoken with my solicitors in London. By the end of the month, your name will be legally changed. You'll be Thomas Thorne, acknowledged as my heir. It's not something I'm doing because I have to, it's something I want because you deserve it, because it's the truth. Thomas nodded slowly, testing the name silently. Thomas Thorne. Will I have to call you Your Grace all the time? He asked suddenly, even when it's just us. Alexander considered this. What would you like to call me? The boy was quiet for a moment, then very softly. Could I call you father? The word hung in the air between them, fragile and perfect. Alexander's throat tightened. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Father, Thomas said again, as if trying it out. Then, with more confidence, Father, would you teach me to play properly, the way you do? Yes, Alexander's voice was rough but warm. I'll teach you music, and writing, and how to manage the estate, and probably a dozen other things I don't even know I know yet. We have time for all of it. How much time? The rest of our lives. Thomas leaned against him, a comfortable weight against Alexander's side. That sounds good, the boy murmured. The rest of our lives sounds very good. They sat together until Mrs. Hartley came looking for them, announcing breakfast was growing cold, and would they please come to the dining room before cook had an apoplexy. As they walked through the halls together, father and son, duke and heir, Alexander felt Alina's presence like a benediction. She wasn't here to see this moment, this beginning, but somehow he thought she knew. Somehow he thought she was finally at peace. At the dining room door, Thomas paused and looked up at him. Father, he said, and the word came easily now, naturally. Thank you for not giving up on me, on us. Alexander rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. Thomas, he said quietly, you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to believe in second chances. I should be thanking you. They entered the dining room together, and for the first time in 8 long years, Ashford Park felt like a home again. 5 years passed. Not quickly, time never moves quickly when you're learning to be a family, but steadily, like the turning of seasons. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, and slowly, the house that had been a monument to duty and restraint became something else entirely. It became loud. Thomas, 12 now, all gangly limbs and boundless energy, thundered through the halls in a way that would have scandalized the previous Duke of Ashford. He left books scattered in improbable places. He tracked mud from the stables. He argued enthusiastically about philosophy over dinner, just as his mother once had. And Alexander discovered he wouldn't change a single moment of the chaos. The boy had grown tall, though he'd never have his father's height. His features had sharpened, become more defined. The resemblance to Alina was unmistakable now, the same intelligent dark eyes, the same determined set to his jaw, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking through a problem. But he had Alexander's sense of honor, his stubbornness, his inability to let injustice stand unchallenged. They'd settled into a rhythm together, morning rides across the estate, afternoons in the study, where Alexander taught Thomas the intricacies of land management, and Thomas taught Alexander to laugh at his own seriousness. Evenings in the music room, where they played duets that grew more complex and beautiful with each passing month. The gossip had died down within a year. Lady Ashworth had seen to that, championing Thomas's cause in every drawing room in the county. By the time the boy turned 10, most people had forgotten there'd ever been scandal attached to his birth. Those who remembered spoke of Alina Ashton with respect now, the governess who'd been wronged, the mother who'd raised a remarkable son despite impossible circumstances, the woman whose dignity had outlasted the lies told about her. Catherine, exiled to Yorkshire, was rarely mentioned at all. On a bright morning in early May, Alexander woke to find Thomas already dressed and waiting in the entrance hall, a small bundle wrapped in cloth tucked under his arm. Ready? The boy asked. Alexander nodded. They'd been planning this visit for weeks, waiting for the weather to clear, waiting for the right moment. Today was the anniversary of Alina's death. 6 years since she'd passed in that freezing Cheapside attic. 6 years since Thomas had begun his long walk to Ashford Park. They rode to London in silence, the city gradually rising around them as green countryside gave way to cobblestones and chimney smoke. The cemetery where Alina was buried lay on the eastern edge of the city, a modest churchyard. Nothing grand, just rows of simple headstones beneath aging trees. Alexander had purchased the plot 3 years ago, after he'd finally tracked down where the parish had buried her. He'd commissioned a proper headstone to replace the unmarked grave. Alina Ashton 1792-1820, beloved mother, Veritas nunquam paret. They stood before it now, father and son, while morning light filtered through the leaves overhead. Thomas knelt and carefully unwrapped his bundle. Inside was his mother's prayer book, the only possession he'd carried with him on that desperate walk 6 years ago. Its cover was worn smooth by her hands, its pages soft with age and use. He'd kept it carefully preserved all these years, refusing to let anyone else touch it. Now he opened it gently, and Alexander saw what Thomas had written on the inside cover in careful script. To Mama, you were right, truth never perishes. Father found me, we found each other, you would be proud, I love you always, Thomas. The boy placed the prayer book at the base of the headstone, along with a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked that morning from the Ashford Park gardens. The same flowers that grew in the rose garden, where Alexander and Alina had walked together all those years ago. I wanted her to know, Thomas said quietly, that we're all right, that she didn't fail, that everything she did, everything she taught me, it mattered. Alexander's throat was too tight to speak. He placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder and simply stood there, honoring the woman who'd given him so much and asked for so little in return. The woman he'd loved and failed and would mourn for the rest of his life. She loved you, you know, Thomas said suddenly. Even after everything, even when she was dying. She told me you'd been kind to her, that you'd made her happy. She said if I ever found you, I should tell you? He paused, searching for the exact words. She said to tell you she understood, that she forgave you, that she hoped you'd forgive yourself. Alexander bowed his head, unable to stop the tears that came. I don't know if I can, he whispered. She said you'd say that too. Thomas looked up at him with Alina's eyes. She said you were too hard on yourself, that you carried too much guilt for things you couldn't control. She said, his voice cracked slightly. She said she'd lived a hard life, but loving you wasn't one of the hard parts. That was the easy part. They stood together in the quiet churchyard while the city woke around them. Eventually, Thomas wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders with that particular dignity he'd inherited from his mother. We should go, he said. We have that meeting with the solicitors this afternoon about the scholarship fund. Ah yes, the Alina Ashton Memorial Fund for the Education of Young Women. Alexander's way of ensuring that other bright, capable girls wouldn't be denied opportunities simply because of their birth. They'd established it 2 years ago, and it already supported a dozen students. In a moment, Alexander said. He knelt beside the headstone, placed his hand flat against the cool marble. I found him, Alina, he said softly. Our son, and he's extraordinary, brave and brilliant and kind just like you. I'm teaching him everything I know, but the truth is he's teaching me more. How to laugh, how to forgive, how to live with an open heart instead of a closed one. He paused, struggling with words. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you. I'm sorry I believed lies instead of trusting what I knew was true. But I promise you, I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life making sure Thomas knows how much you loved him, how much you sacrificed for him, how extraordinary you were. The breeze stirred the tree branches overhead, and for a moment, Alexander could almost feel her presence. Almost hear her voice saying what she'd always said when he apologized for things beyond his control. Stop being so dramatic, Alexander. Just do better going forward. He smiled despite his tears. Come on, father, Thomas said gently. She knows, I think she's always known. They rode back to Ashford Park as the sun climbed higher, father and son, two people learning daily how to honor the woman who'd bound them together even in her absence. That evening, as had become their custom, they played music together in the drawing room. Thomas had grown skilled enough now to attempt real pieces, Mozart, Haydn, even some Bach. His technique wasn't perfect, but his feeling was exquisite. When they finished, Alexander closed the sheet music and looked at his son. Your mother would be proud, he said, of the man you're becoming. Thomas smiled. I hope so. I'm trying to be worth what she gave up for me. You already are, you've always been. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell outside and candles were lit throughout the house. Father, Thomas said eventually. And yes, do you think people can be redeemed, even when they've failed in terrible ways? Alexander thought of Catherine, alone in Yorkshire. Of his own father, dead these 3 years, who'd never acknowledged his mistakes. Of himself, still working daily to become the father Thomas deserved. I think, he said carefully, that redemption isn't something you achieve once and then you're finished. It's something you choose every day. You wake up and you decide to do better, to be better, to let truth guide you instead of convenience or fear. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Mama used to say something similar. She said dignity isn't about never falling, it's about how you stand back up. She was right about at and about most things. I miss her, Thomas said quietly. So do I every day. But we have each other. Yes, Alexander pulled his son close, grateful beyond words for this second chance he'd never thought he'd get. We have each other. And that's more than I deserve, but exactly what I need. Outside, stars emerged in the darkening sky. Inside Ashford Park, a fire crackled in the hearth. And two people who'd found each other against impossible odds sat together in the warmth, honoring the memory of a woman whose love had saved them both. Truth never perishes. Eleanor Ashton had taught her son that lesson. And now, 6 years after her death, her vindication was complete. Not because society had acknowledged her innocence, though they had. Not because her name had been cleared, though it had been. But because the boy she'd raised with such fierce love and dignity had grown into exactly the kind of man she'd hoped he'd become. And the man who'd loved her and lost her had finally learned what she'd always known, that truth, patience, and love could outlast any lie. If Thomas's journey from a freezing gate to a place of belonging stirred something in you, if you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, or watched someone you love suffer unjustly, I want to hear from you. What moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it Eleanor's silent sacrifice, Thomas's courage, Alexander's redemption, or the truth finally coming to light? Leave a comment below and share what resonated with you. And if you believe stories like this one matter, stories about dignity, truth, and second chances, subscribe to this channel so you never miss them. Because every week, I bring you tales of people who refuse to let injustice have the final word. People who, like Eleanor and Thomas, proved that truth never truly perishes. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, no matter how dark the road, no matter how heavy the burden, your truth is worth fighting for, just as theirs was.